Good afternoon, it's Lee Cassidy from Tactile Technology. We were supposed to do a session yesterday about cloud native applications and operations, but due to a bit of an issue, we couldn't do it at that time, so we've had to rearrange for this afternoon. So I'm just going to bring in Erikjan Franssen. How are you, Erikjan?
Hey, hi Lee. Thanks for having me on again. It's been a while since we last spoke, I think at your event like mid-April, so it's great to be on again. Thank you.
And, this is a precursor to what we're doing at the 29th of June, when we're actually going to do a session all around cloud native applications and operations. But I thought it'd be good to start that by talking a little bit about cloud native and what it means to people and some of the challenges and benefits, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely, ready to roll.
Well, I thought we'd start with a bit of history because, I've been around in IT since 1980 and we didn't have cloud in 1980. Well, the only type of cloud were white things that floated in the sky. There was nothing to do with technology. It was cloud related at that point in time. So if we look back, we used to have physical machines and then we went towards cloud server type operations. But there was a big step change when we got to virtualization, and hypervisors like Citrix and VMware became quite popular, but also in the open source community, KVM was being developed as well. So they were the precursors before we start to get to this cloud type environment. But then the next real step was when Amazon, using their technology they developed to actually run their retail operations and large data centers, decided to start to sell that to other people to utilize for compute. So that was a big step change, and that became the cloud. So what's your thoughts on cloud and the misuse of the word cloud as well, Erikjan?
Well, my view is, first of all, I don't mind the misuse of the word cloud. What I do mind is the misuse of the word as a primary business objective. So where companies come in, and especially larger legacy companies, and all of a sudden start adopting what they call a cloud first strategy or a cloud only strategy. And I understand, in order to drive business change, in order to get through some of the hiccups or some of the political barriers or physical barriers or even organizational or bureaucratic barriers, you sometimes need to do something radical. But in my view, as a shareholder of a company or a governmental organization or as a stakeholder in that, having a cloud first or a cloud first strategy or a cloud only objective doesn't say me anything from a business perspective. It doesn't tell me that you're going to operate your business better. It doesn't tell me that you're going to change your outcomes for your stakeholders, whether it be people internally, people externally, your customers, the governmental agencies, regulatory agencies. It doesn't fundamentally change it. So for me, I have trouble in the word cloud as a single objective.
I think it's similar to in the green world, where people are trying to make their business look more green. They greenwash. It's like a thing like cloud washing, isn't it?
Yes.
Now we're really forward thinking because we're utilizing cloud. We don't actually know what cloud is, but we're using it. And I think maybe we could coin another term, cloud appropriate strategy. So actually picking the right applications to use in a cloud environment. What do you think to that?
Well, it's interesting, right? In the past, there used to be the saying in IT, nobody gets fired for selecting IBM, right? That was a saying in the market. And right now, it seems like it's nobody gets fired for selecting Google, Amazon, or Microsoft, as long as the word cloud comes into it, right? And which is entirely fine, because I believe that these hyperscalers have a perfect role, and they did drive fundamental transformation in financial institutions, governmental agencies. And I'm a big supporter of that cloud adoption. But what I'm saying is, you got to think of your business objective, and that can be a business objective of an individual company part or a company's part of the business. It can be an objective of a single application, and then you got to figure out what the right strategy and the right deployment strategy is, where you're going to put it, why you're going to put it there, whether you're going to run into regulatory, compliance, security issues. And then you take the decision based on a business case, cost versus benefit, and all the other elements in your company. where you're going to deploy that application and where you're going to work and where you're going to approach your stakeholders, like your internal employees, your external customers, or any regulatory agency, and take benefit from using those capabilities. And in a lot of cases, hyperscalers and cloud hyperscalers have the benefit of the doubt. Yeah, they provide you that unlimited connectivity. Yes, they provide you that flexibility and elasticity around your infrastructure footprint. Yes, they provide you the capability no longer to think on a day-to-day basis about your lifecycle management of your infrastructure components, because they take care of it. Yes, they provide all these add-on technologies, all these capabilities that you might have to develop in-house, and they already bring it in a ready set capability. So yes, in a lot of ways, those hyperscalers, there's a reason for them to be there, but make the decision based upon your outcomes, not based upon some sort of set strategy.
Yeah, so coming back to a couple of things you said there, I think are very valuable in this. Cloud operators and cloud services allow us to, one, scale to whatever size we want, especially if we need rapid growth, or we've got an operation that goes up and down throughout the year at different periods. So it's a real benefit there. I think it's also a real benefit that you don't have to go through that iterative process of deciding what to buy for your infrastructure, implementing that infrastructure. By the time you've done that, you've got to start again, because it used to be like 3-year cycles most people would do for compute and storage and network infrastructure. It takes you away from that. But I think two areas that the people should think about it is cloud doesn't make it cheaper. It never does. It's always going to be more expensive than doing operations on premise, but it does take away some of the issues about running on premise. I think the other side of things is people make this assumption that everything's protected and everything's secure and all the data is protected in a cloud environment, which again is quite untrue. The infrastructure itself is protected, but the applications, the data and things, that's your responsibility. So there are a couple of things I think people forget about when they're going down this cloud-centric or cloud-first approach with it. It's not always the right thing to do for everything. So let's talk a little bit about how things have changed then. So first of all, cloud operations were virtual machines and some storage capabilities, interconnects, and then later on we've got this virtual connectivity, doing secure linkages between our on-site and our on-premise. But if we developed using virtual machines, we had this issue of migrating, didn't we? So every time we went from either one provider to another or from on-premise to a provider or vice versa, there's this migration work to do because the workloads didn't work there. Yeah. But we started to move towards this cloud native piece. So what does cloud native mean to you then, Erikjan?
Yeah, so cloud native, and I've shared that in my previous presentation when I was on the previous call, right? So what is cloud native for me, right? So the power of cloud native and containerization is that it fundamentally changes the way the application developers create and deploy applications, because no longer do they deploy fully monolithic applications that are tied with the underlying infrastructure, but they build up these applications and components in reusable Lego blocks. And every single developer has a responsibility for the capability of a Lego block. And then the final application gets distributed, deployed, and it's a combination of those Lego blocks or a combination of those components that make the final application, which basically supports and effectively runs the entire agile approach of developing applications, right? Now, if you adopt that type of technology and if you adopt cloud native deployment, then it will enable a quick culture of quick time to market, right? And you will continue to challenge the status quo because you're iterative developing components in your application. So you have an application, a certain payment app with a paywall in it. That individual developer might develop the component for the paywall app a lot further and start challenging the status quo, because then all of a sudden the other part of the application needs to be developed as well to support this advanced capability in there. And then it supports this culture, and I talked about that before, it supports this culture of failing fast, right? I think that is clear towards an agile development approach, is that you got to learn to fail fast, and you got to learn to fail. You learn from your failures, then you fix it, and then you go on. And I think that cloud native and containers in the end got that enables that way of development. And then it is a role of the company and a role of the infrastructure and operations perspective to actually facilitate a platform to run that on, so that your application developers have a seamless experience, whether they deploy that application in the public cloud, whether it's needed to run it on premise, and whether you have that what they call hybrid cloud approach, where you're able to migrate applications between the one cloud and the other. So I think those are, for me, the key benefits of cloud native development.
Yes, if you look at the agile side of things, like you say, it's going to give an organization the ability to develop in different areas of their application set quickly, separate it out in different groups of people, so they can charge forward and get something done rapidly. Because the old style development, you'd be looking at 6 monthly or annual releases. Whereas people nowadays, I think Netflix do something like 7 releases a week of different parts of code. So that agile development allows you to move forward, but also prioritize areas that are important to the business, to the user population, to a particular marketplace as well. But also it allows you to fix problems quickly as well. So if you find you've got a vulnerability in a particular component, you can fix that one thing really quickly and build out. I think the other thing, the move to containers also helps us with the ability to scale in areas where we need scale. Because if you've got a monolithic approach to development, you have one big lump of code, you have to actually scale the whole thing. And sometimes it's only maybe 10% of that code base actually needs, particular performance. So if you split it out into microservices, then you can actually focus on scaling the bits that need to be scaled as well.
Definitely. No, absolutely. I fully agree with that.
Yeah. So let's talk about the difference between containers and Kubernetes, or as it was CoreOS many, many years ago before it became Kubernetes. But Kubernetes isn't a container. Kubernetes is an orchestrator, and a container is just where you can run a piece of code that's developed for a particular container type. So most people will be familiar with Docker as being one of the providers of containers, but there are a number of other orchestrators that are out there that have disappeared as well. So what do you think's happening in that space at the moment, the orchestration space?
So very interesting. As containers came around, immediately the requirement for orchestration of those containers, right? Because it's a distributed application, so the application components keep floating around in different places. And there was a requirement for some level of orchestration, whether it came down to network connectivity, whether it came down to storage availability, whether it came down to behavior of these individual containers. You needed to make sure that was orchestrated in a proper fashion. Now, obviously, from the history, CoreOS came up, tried to help out with that. Docker was effectively the runtime of the container itself, but then the orchestration layer around it needed to be developed. What is interesting, CoreOS was picked up by Google, then made into an orchestration layer, and then given back to the open source community. And effectively, that became Kubernetes. And Kubernetes is nothing else than an orchestration layer that will help you organize the relationships between the different containers and help you build that final application. Now, with the coming of Kubernetes as an open source project, tons of developers started to contribute to that, which had a few benefits because it developed in a really fast-paced fashion, and tons of issues were resolved quickly, and tons of very intelligent engineers, especially working at the big companies. Think of Apple, think of Uber, think of marketing companies like Taboola. Some very intelligent people started communicating to that or contributing to that orchestration framework. And then it became the de facto orchestrator in the market. So that's a benefit. So effectively, if you're going cloud native, container native, there's only one way to go right now, which is Kubernetes, and which is kind of unique in the IT landscape, because settling around standards is not always the best, what we do best, right? Every organization usually has its own perspective to the way they work. And the good news is that the Cloud Native Foundation keeps that central control over what is contributed to Kubernetes, and Kubernetes is effectively the de facto orchestrator for anything that's cloud native. So that's a benefit. But with that came a lot of challenges, right? So because effectively, as they started contributing, lots of functionality was added, lots of technology was added, but it's always been an open source project run by people that have multiple PhDs in this market field. And it doesn't mean that every enterprise or every company has the same level of intelligence and resources in their organization, right? Because Kubernetes and applications distributed and distributed applications come with certain challenges. They come with security challenges, they come with operations challenges, and I'll have some details on that, but they come with a certain set of challenges. And in order to solve those challenges, tons of vendors came up. So there's tons of vendors that were working in the orchestration side of the house, so added capabilities to orchestration, allowing you to run infrastructure and manage and monitor infrastructure. A lot of companies came around that worked in telemetry, right? Anything that has to do with monitoring and making sure that the application run properly. Then a whole set of vendors came around that fixed security problems. Then a whole set of vendors came around that fixed application development problems. So tons of vendors came around, but that didn't make the landscape a lot easier. And it also challenged a bit the place where Kubernetes is placed, because effectively there is a bit of a fight going on, and there's always been a fight going on in enterprises between development and operations, right? Who leads the charge? And especially Kubernetes makes that very visible. So what is Kubernetes? Is that a development facility or is it an operations facility? I have my own opinion, but I think those challenges came around when Kubernetes came.
I think the other challenge is who looks after the security of it as well.
Yes.
You know, is it the DevOps team that looks after the security of it, or is it the main security team, or does it transition as it moves from development to production? So there's going to be a lot of things there. But it's quite interesting you were talking about how things have changed. And if you look at a lot of the more traditional tools that were around for Docker implementations, like Swarm, like Rancher, like these other technologies from Red Hat as well with their platform. But originally they were managing the containers themselves, but as time's gone on, they've actually changed now. Then what they do is they utilize now Kubernetes to actually run the containers. So they're just becoming a front end for Kubernetes, and so that's a big step change, I think. Like you say, a lot of the cloud providers now, all their container services are using Kubernetes now. There's no other options, I don't think, out there.
No, absolutely, and that's clear. The development is really moving in that direction.
Yeah, but coming back to your point about the original people from CoreOS and Kubernetes, data scientists and developers. Not everybody's got those, have they? It's a challenge. And a lot of organizations, if they want to move towards running some form of Kubernetes themselves on premise, have got a real challenge. And they're also quite challenged if they want to run it in any of the cloud provider platforms as well, because a lot of it is command line. It's understanding how to put together Helm charts for deployment. It's very much a process-driven pipelines deployment piece as well, but also there's a real challenge about how do you pull the metrics out of it? How do you understand what's happening, what's working, what's not working, and those kind of things. So let's talk in that space a little bit.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I've always joked in my past year that as I joined Diamanti, I've always said there's a few people in the world that really understand Kubernetes. I think 2 or 3 of them are in our leadership, in our engineering, maybe even more, maybe 5 or 10 that really understand fundamentally Kubernetes. And there's probably a handful of others in other companies, and the rest of us is faking it, right? So I mean, the real understanding of what's going on is difficult, right? And I got my hands this morning on a Gartner report that actually came out already in February of this year, about container workload adoption, and they did some investigations amongst their enterprises on what they found was the biggest challenge, who was responsible, and I got some numbers here, but it's really interesting. If you look at the top container development challenges, the sum of the top 3 is 62% is talking about lack of skilled resources, and then 30% had that answer as a first choice. So the key challenge of any enterprise in deploying containers is the lack of skilled resources. So they can't find the people that are actually enabled to productionalize and help productionalize these workloads. And even
I think
with
the other challenge can be, it's not finding the people, it's having the
retaining it, right? Because
they're so expensive.
Yeah, and they're becoming more and more expensive because they know their capability is unique. But then another interesting thing, if you look at the sum of the top three answers on the second problem, is operational complexity. And I think they go hand in hand between the lack of talent and the operational complexity, right? It's because people find it complicated to run these applications in production, especially when you go to stateful applications where data comes into play. But as I just talked about it, right? How do you get telemetry out of it? How do you monitor and see what's going on with your application? If you're moving between clouds, how do you manage it? And then the third answer, and it's really interesting, is security concerns. So effectively, lack of talent, operational complexity, and security concerns. Those are the key challenges, according to Gartner in their investigation out of February of this year, of deployment challenges in adopting Kubernetes. And I think that is it's becoming problematic, and it needs to be solved. I think the Cloud Native Foundation does a good job in trying to educate new people into what Kubernetes is, but not every person is ready to do that, right? You need to be a pretty skilled engineer, a pretty knowledgeable engineer to really get the benefit of Kubernetes. And I know tons of startups where I know some very, very intelligent CTOs that are even challenged by the complexity of Kubernetes.
Yeah, and I think it's a real challenge, that space. And I think the other issue you're going to get is the more complex things you start to achieve. It's not just, bringing in stateful applications into a container environment. It's how do you then run stateful applications across maybe two different availability zones? How do you do it in two different geographic areas as well, using the same application? So, using that more complicated pods and your I'm losing track of thought here at the moment, and your persistent volumes across that and replication. But there's also the other things that you do in an enterprise space that are missing as well in that, that needs to be added on. Things like the ability to protect the data through snapshotting and replication, and those kind of things. So there's some real challenges for a lot of organizations to be able to do this and do it right. And I think some of the other pieces, like we talked about monitoring, it gets very big, especially with a large enterprise. Instead of being, looking at 500 to 1,000 virtual machines, which is achievable with most monitoring tools, we move into many hundreds of thousands of containers, that stretch across, multiple geographies and also multiple application sets. And that becomes a real challenge to monitor and manage it at that point.
But I think one of the great things, and it comes out of this Gartner report as well, and I've been shouting that for a while, there needs to be a fundamental consensus in an organization between dev and ops. And that fundamental consensus, and we just talked about it, right? Development develops these applications inside containers, but effectively Kubernetes and anything that has to do with this cloud native development in containers should be considered as infrastructure and should be run by the operations department, and they should provide the facility to the application developers to utilize those capabilities. And then there should be a consensus between the application developers on the required tool set and the required tool set from infrastructure operations that needs to be there. There needs to be a consensus between whether you deploy it in public cloud or whether you have the facility to deploy it on premise, and what the rules of engagement are. But the consensus needs to be that Kubernetes is infrastructure, cloud native is infrastructure, and it should be run by the infrastructure team. And that also in itself creates a challenge, because in certain enterprises, especially high velocity market ad tech companies, development runs the show, right? Because effectively they run no ops type of situations, right? Because they don't want to deal with infrastructure, they want to deal with application development. And if you look at the traditional enterprise, usually the infrastructure team is much more aligned to okay, what kind of hardware do I have? What are specifications? How do I deal with telemetry and monitoring? But not so much higher up the application stack. And Kubernetes sits right in the middle. But I believe that Kubernetes in itself and the facility of the Kubernetes capability is an infrastructure problem, and as such should be dealt with by the infrastructure team. And the CTO and the chief and the operations officer, or the person that runs the VP of IT operations, should have this in his remit and should be knowledgeable and capable of providing those facilities to any application development team there is, whether it's the AI/ML teams, or whether it's the home build application teams, or whether it's teams that are deploying off-the-shelf applications. So I think that is that create the most successful companies that I know in deploying this have dealt with this as an infrastructure problem.
So a couple of things, you mentioned this report. So what we'll do is we'll make that available for people to download later, because I think that would be useful for people to have access to that. So were there any other key areas that were raised in that report you think would be worth us mentioning today?
Yeah, so it was another interesting, knowledgeable, right? We talk about cloud native, right? And cloud native, we talked about it, right? The misuse of the word cloud and the use of it. And there were some other interesting findings here, right? So they were looking at the primary container usage method, which is effectively cloud native technology, right? And these hyperscalers, especially with the contracts they sign with the enterprises all over the world, they make us believe that Kubernetes is deployed in Amazon and Google, and it's all about the cloud, right? And it turns out that from the respondents, 39% of the responses says we are using it for on-premise container orchestration. And then only 27% is using the cloud container or service. And then the great thing is there only 14% is using a combination of on-premise and cloud when it comes down to these cloud native or container applications, which is really interesting, right? Because we always believe that cloud native is cloud only, but if you look at cloud native and Kubernetes, the majority of the applications, so like 40% of that, is still only deployed on-premise. So the premise of having that all in cloud, or that hybrid cloud methodology where we could just lift and shift capabilities around between on-premise and cloud and back, that whole premise is true, and it's being preached by a lot of companies in this market. But effectively, if you look at reality, that's not the truth at all. So I think that's a very interesting response that came out of it.
Yeah, and coming onto that hybrid cloud piece, I think that's a real advantage of cloud native, that you can do that, but it's also using it for the right reasons. Yeah, yes. It could be that you've got more control and security and performance of your Kubernetes environment on premise, and you use, say, a cloud environment for the development and deploy onto premise. It could be vice versa in the way you do it. It could be that you utilize two different cloud providers, because you've got then no lock-in between cloud providers. Because I think that could be a challenge for a lot of organizations in the future, being locked into a particular cloud provider. What do you think to that?
Well, that's interesting. I think that is an undervalued problem, that is not an under-recognized problem, that is not being fully dealt with in the market yet. And I think the market has to be waking up to this. I mean, we have seen vendor lock-in in the past in the IT world for ages, right? We have had vendor lock-in when it came down to our printers in our PCs. We've had vendor lock-in when it came down to outsourcing full application stacks or full IT stacks. We have had vendor lock-in where, the biggest example was between EDS and General Motors, right? Where they were completely tied together, and there was a single IT vendor in there. And so we've had multiple iterations of vendor lock-in, and sometimes vendor lock-in is not a bad thing, right? Having a trusted partner to join with is a good thing. But keep in mind, all those hyperscalers have a single objective, and their single objective is making you use more of their infrastructure so they can increase the bill of what they invoice to you, right? And that is sometimes, I would say, not recognized in the market yet. That is like the wolf in sheep's clothes that we still need to come out, the Trojan horse that needs to come out. And it's interesting, right? You have if you look at this Gartner report, the top container adoption business goals, if you look at preventing lock-in, vendor lock-in, it's only recognized out of 8, it's in place number 6, right? So it's not the first priority yet. And I think what we'll start seeing slowly but gradually, and you'll see these European cloud initiatives coming up, like OVH Cloud, that has this whole European cloud initiative building because we want data privacy, we want more security, more control over our data. Once we start recognizing that American data centers or data centers provided by these hyperscalers are not always the financially and regulatory most sane decision, then I think preventing vendor lock-in will start increasing into it will start increasing in its priority. So I don't think that out of this research done in 2019 to 2020, it was at the place where it should be. And I think it deserves a lot more attention coming towards the future. And the biggest example is already known, right? I mean, Amazon ran retail IT for tons of retailers in the market, right? I mean, they had outsourcing contracts with Walmart and other retailers in the market. And effectively, Amazon had run infrastructure for their own bookshop, but never done full retail, right? They have never done retail with fresh products and stationary products and products so they had to learn that business. And guess what? A year later or a few years later, they bought Whole Foods Market, right? And they start their own retailer. Google is signing tons of contracts, and I really applaud them for them. I applaud Google Cloud and Thomas Kurian and his entire team for what they're doing, because they're signing tons of contracts with financial institutions. But you'll start seeing that in a few years from now, you'll have Google Finance starting to expand its business, and they will start their own bank. And what they'll have learned by that time, they'll have learned about the core banking processes. They'll have learned how to run a financial institution, but then do it a lot better because they're basically Google. So that vendor lock-in notion might not even be problematic from a cost or other perspective. It might become problematic from a competitive perspective, because these companies are starting to learn so much, and they'll take it over, right? That they can, what you do, they can do better.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Another report that might be of interest to people as well is PwC did a report at the end of last year that came out, I think it was January or February this year, talking about discussions with UK CEOs about what was important to them going forward for the next year or two. And one of the key areas there was digital transformation. They said 88% of CEOs believed digital transformation was a key thing for their future budgets, but also many of them said the work they'd done towards digital transformation last year allowed them to get through the pandemic, which was quite interesting. And the two areas that they saw as a challenge going forward with this is one we've already mentioned. The ability to find skilled and experienced staff is becoming a real challenge, and that's going to hold them back. But another area of real worry is security. And I don't think it matters what type of technology you're utilizing, there is a risk for cybersecurity. We've seen more ransomware attacks. We've seen more people with technology that's actually been flawed in some way from the operating system providers. Some of the manufacturers are monitoring. SolarWinds was one of the key ones that we heard about last year with what happened at FireEye, and then we realized it was actually something like 30,000 different customers had been compromised through this hack that had been done within SolarWinds. So I think there's some real challenges in those spaces as well that we need to address going forward. But I think there are ways to do things if you take the right approach and you consider how you're going to deploy your cloud native strategy and the implementation of that alongside how you'd implement infrastructure, like we spoke of earlier.
Yeah, well, I mean, from a security perspective, right, I've always said the safest way to run your IT application is to put it inside of a NOC, close it off completely, provide no external access, and nobody can access the application, and then the data in the application will be entirely safe, right? But unfortunately, that's not possible for tons of applications.
I'm ex-military, and we used to say that the only safe computer was an air-gap computer.
Yeah, there you go. So
anything else.
Yeah, there you go. So you need to put it in an air gap, and then whatever, right? But as soon as you start introducing interaction, in the whole world of IT is as soon as you start introducing interaction, there is security issues, right? And it's always risk versus reward. What kind of risks are you willing to run? I mean, data privacy is now becoming a hot subject because GDPR came into place, but even in California, there's tons of privacy laws. Turkey adopted a very strict KVKK. So data leak and data loss prevention and making sure that people's credit cards numbers and everything doesn't get caught in a security hack is a key priority, right? But there's so many areas of where should you start when it comes down to deploying this. In the cloud native world, I think it's about thinking fundamentally from the ground up, security build in, and then make a decision based on your risk appetite, right? Certain applications probably don't need to be as closed off as others because the data resides in a different place, and other applications need to be completely protected. So I think that's a risk-based assessment that you need to start making. And I think that in the Kubernetes world and in the cloud native world, there's tons of capabilities and platforms, and even Diamanti's platform that come in with built-in security controls to make sure that things like that don't happen.
Yeah, one example from my experience with Diamanti compared to if you built it out on a standard Linux platform on bare metal is Kubernetes on bare metal with a Linux deployment tends to have all of the networks connected to the outside world natively. Yes. And with Diamanti, it's the opposite. None of the networks are connected to the outside world until you connect them, which I think makes a big difference because you're inherently safe until you start to deploy the application, which I think helps.
And I think a ton of these application vendors, and especially mine as well, so Diamanti in itself decided to take fundamentally that approach to make sure that security gets built from the ground up. And I think as we go along, we'll see a lot more security hacks, and we'll probably undergo some personal problems in that as well, right? So we had maybe the pandemic now, and we'll have a security pandemic at some point, and we'll all undergo some of it. And I just think that we should take it in the strategy as preventing vendor locking. I think security should be something that is being considered by every IT executive that's on the market needs to be thinking about.
So just final thing to talk about, and something I think is quite important based on conversations I've had with people, is because the organizations have got limited skills and capabilities around Kubernetes, and they can't really buy in the skills at the cost they want to. What they're tending to do is give up on running it natively and actually move back to using hypervisors. Yep. So we're seeing people running containers within predominantly VMware, but we see other platforms as well, like Hyper-V. But they bring out additional challenges because, one, your licensing costs dramatically increase to run the operation, but you also get this situation where particular users of like God rights, and if they're not careful about the naming convention when they're actually creating their containers and the hosts, there are possibilities where someone could actually shut down intentionally what they believe is, say, a development environment that they're tearing down, and accidentally tear down a production environment. And I do know of at least 2, if not 3 organizations that have had that issue, predominantly using VMware with Linux workloads running Docker. And that can be a real challenge for a lot of organizations, that granularity and role-based access to different effective projects and areas.
Well, here's from that Gartner report, going back to that, here's a place where I fundamentally disagree with Gartner in the report. So I'll shout it out loud. Because they're talking about expects innovation across the following areas, and it's a short sentence, so I'll just mention it here. They talk about bare metal, and they're saying it's still too early to see significant traction, but more organizations are considering bare metal deployments that do not utilize server virtualization. A major drawback is that the operational tooling to support bare metal deployments still significantly lacks traditional virtual machines deployments. And I think that's where Gartner takes an entire wrong approach towards the benefits and the capabilities that you have here. So you had containers, and then you have a perfect orchestration layer that can take care of all the elements that you need to do inside of your IT infrastructure. Introducing virtualization under that for those applications creates a whole set of problems, and it creates a new set of problems because now you're not only monitoring and managing and taking the telemetry of the Kubernetes orchestration layer. Now all of a sudden you're also managing the virtual machines that are in the middle. And you just mentioned licensing costs and all that stuff, but let's take cost out of the equation. Let's say cost, because you need to have the capabilities and people that can run it. Let's say cost is not a problem. Then you're just adding a layer of complexity in terms of performance. You're adding a layer of complexity in terms of security. You're adding a layer of complexity. And the only reason you're doing it is to satisfy the traditional. And let's come back to what I mentioned at the start of this presentation, is one of the reasons people go cloud native and people go this way is because it allows them to challenge the status quo. Once you're adding that traditional layer to it, you're effectively saying, well, I'm challenging the status quo, but not really, right? I mean, that's what I see. And I don't think it's a viable strategy moving forward. I think people think it will now reduce a little bit of complexity, so they're entirely fine with it. So that's why they run it in this way. But I disagree with Gartner, and I see tons of traction, and I see tons of companies that are just moving to bare metal and saying, we don't need that whole virtual machine and virtual layer in the middle, because that layer introduces complexity and difficulty of operation. So that's my view.
Okay, so I think we've covered enough today, because what we do want people to do is come along to our event about cloud native applications on the 29th of June, starting at 1 p.m. through till 5. We've got four main keynote sessions. We've got a number of breakout sessions in different areas of how to utilize cloud native for your organization. Some specific pieces we're going to cover in there. So we're going to start advertising that from tomorrow. What we'll also do is put up the Gartner report for a link so people can download that. I'll also dig out the one from PwC that I mentioned earlier, because I think that's quite an interesting one to look at as well. So we'll get those together for you. And then if you'd like to join us on the 29th, register. We use the Hopin online events platform. Makes it nice and simple for you to log into Hopin and then pick the particular events you want to go along to. Really simple navigation within Hopin as well. And we also offer a free networking capability, so you can network with peers throughout the event to find other people you might want to work with, maybe find someone to do work for if you're a contractor as well. So join us for that event. That'll be great, and you'll get to speak see Erikjan speak again around this area, but also some more focused sessions in different key areas that we think are important. Any last words, Erikjan?
Yeah, well, I make one big promise for the audience here, is that, as I mentioned, out of the people that understand Kubernetes, I said there's 10 in the world to work with the MIT. I'll make sure I'll have that single person or one of two on that really understands Kubernetes and has an in-depth knowledge on the capabilities, and I'll promise that person will be on and provide a fantastic session in depth. So anybody that is interested in Kubernetes 101 or more in-depth discussions, make sure you join this event, because we'll have the right people on.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to the event on the 29th, and I'm sure we're going to speak again and do a few more little sessions running up to the 29th around what the capabilities of Diamante can add to anyone looking at cloud native deployment.
100%. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.